Uh, so awkward all the time. All right. So, all right, everyone. Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Uh, so today, I would like to first of all begin by doing a land acknowledgement, and you know, wherever we are joining from this afternoon, we meet today on Indigenous homelands. The land upon which Pasadena City College now sits on is stolen land, and we want to acknowledge the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of the Tumbagar, better known now as the LA Basin. We recognize we are guests on these lands and want to express respect and admiration for the resilience of these indigenous peoples and cultural leaders in our cities today. Please join me with a moment of silence. Okay, thank you. So today, as part of Associated Students, I chair the ASPCC Sustainability Committee. My name is Emmanuel Gomez, and my preferred pronouns are he, him. Today, we have a special guest, Dr. Hatch. He is a professor at Pasadena City College, instructor of nutrition. Also, aside from that, he is the Flex Calendar program coordinator, and he assists in, developing some sort of training that can help our instructors better understand, our diverse cultures and points of views. And also, aside from that, he's working with the kinesiology, health, and athletics program. He is an advisor for the First Club, where he helps maintain the garden there, and also, joins us in our club meetings. As a proud core scholar, he is also an advisor, friend, and family for the program. He has a PhD in nutritional science, which he obtained at the University of Kentucky, and also completed postdoctoral work at UCLA. And aside from that, he he teaches by doing rather than saying. And with that, I present you all Dr. Nicholas Hatch.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for that introduction. I don't know if you all realize it, but just one word, right, can make all the difference. And Emmanuel, when you call me family, that has more meaning to me than you can really know. It makes it worth being a teacher. All the hard work, sometimes overwhelming work. It means a lot, right, when a student says something like that. So all of which is to say, just thank you for that introduction. I'm going to. Oh, you know what? I can't share my screen, Emmanuel.
Sorry about that. Let me see. All right, try it.
There we go. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about food justice, and this is something that is not something that's always been on my radar. It's something that I've actually come to relatively recently. So I have this PhD in nutrition, but I haven't always thought about how just, right, how equitable, right, what I present in my classes is. And so recently I've been learning, right, about what food justice is, and how that really finds its way in, right, how this aspect of social justice finds its way into food, and teaching about food and thinking about food, and how we present that. Emmanuel and I have actually presented on this together as part of the Prison Education Project. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is stuff that I presented as part of that project as well. That was a great opportunity, and I really learned a lot. And I'm pleased to be able to bring some of that to you all today as well, just to help you start thinking about really one of my main objectives is just to help frame kind of what we mean when we say the words food justice, and what that looks like. I'm gonna start with the statement of positionality. I don't know if you all know that. I came up in biomedical research. In biomedical research, we don't really do positionality statements, as if somehow, because it's science, we can't have bias. We can't have things that we want to turn out a specific way. But in the social sciences, right, they do positionality statements all the time, right? Recognizing that who you are and what your experience is plays a role, right, in how you come to topics and how you share those words and how you think about those words and what you want the outcomes to be even. So just in terms of who I am, I'm a white U.S. citizen, U.S. born citizen. What does that mean, right? It means that I'm accustomed to certain foods, right, that are presented as healthy foods, certain food availabilities, right? It means that I've worked different jobs, right, and maybe had different interactions with food in terms of the way that I've worked, the way that I've made money, the way that food is distributed to me, right, how it comes to me, and so there are a lot of things, right, that get wrapped up in being a white U.S. citizen and what that food means, right, and even what foods I consider to be exotic, right, for example, and so it colors, right, the way that I think about food and how I come to food. I'm male, right, and not only that, I'm a cisgender heterosexual male, right, and that plays a role too, right, in terms of if we think about cisgender, why does that matter, right? But body dysmorphia, right, is something that we talk about with regard to food. People viewing their bodies and how they view their bodies and how they eat food, right, based on viewing their bodies and maybe not being happy where their bodies are. And transgender individuals deal with these same issues, right, of body dysmorphia sometimes and not feeling at home in the body they have, right? And so it makes it different, right, to be cisgender and to be a heterosexual male, right? You can think about gender roles, right? And when we think about food and food preparation and whose jobs that historically has been, at least in Western societies, right? There are gender roles, right, into which I am accustomed to fitting. And so that aspect, right, of who I am colors the way that I think about food and the way that I've been raised about food and the way that I talk about food. I'm also middle class, right? So, that means that I've had access to education, housing, and something called food security, right? Knowing where my next meal is going to come from. And so again, that colors how I think about food and how I've experienced food in my life. And so everything that I present here, I present through the eyes, right, of this position, right, in life and this lived experience that I have. And I not only acknowledge that, but would recognize you, would encourage you to recognize, right, not only the words that I say, but the words that you hear, right, and how, what I present may strike you as differently than what your lived experience is and what your perspective is on that. And that's okay. That doesn't make me right and you wrong or having an odd view. It doesn't mean that you need to shape your view to what I'm saying. In fact, I would encourage you to be critical, right, and think about, what I'm saying, what you're hearing, so that we can have a discussion about that and figure out how we move forward, right, how we understand together, right, what these things mean. So I mentioned, right, I kind of came to this, at first in terms of the way that I teach, right? I teach about nutrition. I'm part of a culture of professionals, right, who talk about nutrition and what healthy meals are and what not healthy meals are and why health and good nutrition is important, right? But it strikes me that a lot of times that can be a very one-sided view, right? It can be a very one-sided conversation, right, about what healthy foods are. And when I present certain foods as healthy and other foods are either not healthy or just not even mentioned, right? What am I saying to people, right? So on the left image there, we have some, I don't know, how shall we describe it? A salmon, right? So wild caught salmon, glazed with a sweet balsamic vinegar, tossed over risotto, or actually that's probably not risotto, it's more like bulgur wheat or something, right? And topped with a sweet and spicy mango salsa, with a blend of spice and herbs, maybe with a side of, like a peppery oregano salad and some avocado or something like that, right? Which, great, awesome looking meal. I'd totally eat that, right? And this is very often, right, the sort of thing that's presented as a healthy meal, right? The sort of thing that you should aspire to. And if you're not eating stuff that looks like that, full of color and with all these kind of fancy terminology attached to it, then you're not living up to the ideal, right? And somehow what you eat is less than, right? But that food, right, it looks pretty good to me. That might be something that I'm accustomed to seeing, but it's certainly not going to speak to everybody, right? The middle picture there is tacos de chapulín. Chapulín is or tacos de chapulín is something that's Oaxaca is known for, right? Oaxaca, Mexico. And the word actually, chapulín, comes from the Nahuatl, so the indigenous people language for that type of cricket, right? That's used very often, right? But who's not to say, right? Who's to say that that's not part of a healthy meal, right? There's a lot of benefit, right, to eating something like that, even though it may be something that's very much outside of my experience, or even outside of the experience of people who don't originate in that area, right? To the right of that, right, is something called Natso, right? That's very often eaten for breakfast in Japanese culture and some other Asian cultures. It's fermented soybeans, right? So that's kind of why it's stringy and sticky looking there, is because it's been fermented by bacteria, and so broken down a little bit, right? And so it kind of leads to this kind of goopiness. It's not for everybody, right? It's I might say an acquired taste, right? But if you grew up in Japan eating that for breakfast every day, it's very much a part of what feels comfortable and what feels natural to you, right? And so I kind of pick these two as maybe more kind of out there examples, but even that, right, is a little bit problematic for me to pick those as kind of the weird things, right? Because for me to say, oh, that's weird, right, now is excluding somebody, right, from being normal, right, or from eating something that could be the ideal or something that could be considered healthy. And so what I would encourage you to do is, and what I've been thinking about in my classes is, what am I presenting, right? What narrative am I producing, about what healthy foods are and what weird things are, right? And it's not that you can't look at something and say, ooh, that's outside of my experience, I don't know how to feel about that, right? But it's not a matter of saying, oh God, that's weird, I would never eat that, right? Maybe it's a matter of saying, Dios mío, this is something that I've not experienced before, right? Y'all are metal, right? For trying something, for having something like that that's part of your culture, and that's amazing. And I wish I could be part of that, right? And some things, maybe you try it and it's not necessarily for you, it's not your taste, right? And that's okay, right? Because our connections, I've tried all these things. And it's not about, the objective taste perhaps, right? But also your connection to that food, right? Growing up with that, how you feel about that, what memories it brings, right? And so there's a lot more to food and what food means than just the way it tastes or just whether it's healthy, but also your connection to it, right? And so this is kind of my introduction, right, to thinking about, access to food, right? And how we view, this story of what food is and what food is to people, and whether we are including people, right, or we are excluding, right, or marginalizing some people by talking about, who they are and what they mean in terms of the foods that they eat, right? And it's not just, right, I'm talking about food justice, it's not very just, right, when we're excluding, right, somebody based on the narrative that we tell those people. Right, so let's just frame food justice a little bit more, right? That was my introduction to it, right? But in a perfect world, right, thinking about food, right, and who we include, and who has access to food, right, would mean that everybody has access to education about nutrition, right? That it wouldn't be a specialty subject, that not, some people would learn about it, but other people would not learn about it, right? Everybody, right, would grow up, right, in a culture that cares about food, that thinks about food, that includes foods of all different varieties, and talks about what's good about those foods, right? Why do we eat these foods? Why do we eat these foods in this way, right? And how is that good for us, right? It would mean that we could eat free of stigma, right? The foods that we eat aren't weird, right? The foods that we eat aren't going to make us, fat, right? That we could eat foods, right? And we could think about the positivity of those foods and what those foods contribute to our lives, right? And not have to feel bad, right, about eating food, because food is something that's required for life, right? And so how can we make somebody feel bad, right, for the food choices that they have, the food that they have access to, right? It would mean that the land that we used, right, is available, right, that it's used fairly, that it's not, that we're not gatekeeping, right? Some people get to have land, that get to grow food on land and get to make decisions, right, about how food is grown and how food is distributed and what the byproduct waste is, right, of that food and how that food is grown, right? It becomes an issue of excess, right? When some people get to make decisions and other people are prevented from making those decisions. And when we see how land is used, right, when we see how water is diverted, right, for big agricultural processes, we realize that we don't have fair use of land, right? Thinking back to the land acknowledgement, right, at the very beginning of this, right, where did that land even come from, right? Does that land belong to us? Are we being stewards of that land, right? If we are the so-called stewards of the land now, are we taking care of the land in a way that that acknowledges and respects, right, who was originally on these lands in the first place, right? The right to grow your own food, right? You might think that everybody has the right to grow their own food, but with legal repercussions and policies against where you can grow food and how much food you can grow, and whether this looks right in the neighborhood, right? There are stories, right? You'll see there are policies that communities have against growing food, right? Perhaps by the sidewalk or in your front yard, right? A lot of communities won't allow you to grow things in their front yard because the front yard has to look a certain way, right? And so this becomes then an issue, right, of gatekeeping, right? Who has the right to grow food, to have chickens in their yard, all sorts of things, right? And who does not have that right? And then finally, empowering advocacy, right? Making people feel like they can, right, have a voice, that they're allowed to have a voice, that their voice matters, right? And that not just because, they don't have a lot of money, they don't have a lot of land, therefore they don't have a lot of power. No, I just say no to that, right? So as you might start to be seeing, food justice, right, is not something that lives by itself, right? It's not that it's not disconnected from other areas of social justice. In fact, if you think about social justice, right, being connected to systems of oppression, right, in all areas, right, of social justice, this is really what we're talking about, right? This issue of access, right, and whether it be access to education, right, or it be access to food, or it be access to particular jobs, access to land, right, access to the political system, right? There are lots of things, right? And we see that some people, right, have been advantaged and have an easier time getting into these, and other people have not had their fair shake, right? And that they are disadvantaged, whether they are actively disadvantaged through somebody who's trying to keep them out, right? Or whether they're simply systems that have been set in place so long ago that we have forgotten what those systems even are, and we perpetuate them, and we don't even realize that we're keeping people out, right? And when we look at these systems of oppression, right, they are very often designed not just to oppress within one narrow sliver of social justice, right, but in fact in all areas of social justice, right? And so when I think about access to food, right, what I'm encouraging you to think about, right, is what sorts of barriers exist, right, that gatekeep, right, that allow some people access to food, right, and keep other people from getting the same access to, again, something that we need to be alive, right? And do those same systems, right, then affect access to other things, right? Is it a single system, right, that can bar access to so many different things? And so that's really what we're talking about, right, with food justice, is what systems are in place, right, that advantage some people and allow them to have access to good food, to good nutrition, to good education about that, right, to feel good about what they're doing, right? And how do those same systems simultaneously, right, bar other people from having access to those things, right? Not that it's not a complex issue, it is, right? But there are definitely things in place, right, that advantage some and disadvantage others. So the next few slides, the next 6 slides are sets of 2, right? So a food issue, and then how it's a system of oppression. Then a food issue, how it's a system of oppression, and then a food issue and how it's a system of oppression. Right? So that's what we're going to look at for these next few pairs of slides, right? So the first one is food insecurity, right? And that, may be something that you've heard before, maybe not, right? But all food insecurity is a disruption, right, of food intake or your pattern of eating due to lack of money and resources, right? And so you might say that somebody that doesn't know where their next meal is going to come from, right, would be very insecure, right? Very food insecure, right? Do they not have great security because they don't know where the next meal is going to come from, right? And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have those who know exactly where their next meal is going to come from. They have lots of options even for what that next meal is going to be. They don't even have to think about it. They just know that food is going to be available, right? In whatever form it chooses to be. And of course, there's lots of room in the middle there, right? For people who sometimes know where their next meal is going to come from, but sometimes don't, right? So maybe it's getting towards the end of the month and they've run out of money and they're not sure how they're going to get dinner on the table today or tomorrow, right? But then that paycheck comes and they're able to buy some groceries. And so it can kind of waffle, right, between kind of being food secure and being food insecure. And so you can have these kind of medium levels as well, right? Or people who have access to food and money to buy that food, but not necessarily a whole lot of good choices, right? And so then it becomes more of an eating pattern, right? So yes, there's food available, but what food is it that's available? And then is it going to meet all of their nutritional needs? Right? So if you just look at a few numbers, right, in the US, about 40 million people, that's 12% of the US population collects SNAP benefits. That's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It used to be called food stamps. Right now we call it SNAP benefits. It typically comes on a debit card now, right, instead of being these kind of food stamps. But that's the program. Right? In California, that's called CalFresh, right? And so that 12% translates to about 4.8 million Californians that rely on CalFresh, right? So CalFresh is California's arm of the federal program that provides those SNAP benefits. And it includes a few extras, right? So California has a few extras for people, for instance, who have green cards, right, who wouldn't be able to collect through the federal program, but California injects a little bit of extra money so that they can extend those benefits to a larger population of folks. Right? And then if you just look at our own campus, right, about 7,500 students, that's about 25% of our students visit the Lancer Pantry on a regular basis, right? So food insecurity, right, is a very real issue. And you think, maybe you think about, not knowing where food is going to come from or not having food as being an issue that doesn't affect the US, but it very much does affect the US. And we can see that from these numbers, right? So how's that a system of oppression, right? Well, again, if we think of a system of oppression as simply something that's in place, right, something that exists, that keeps some people from accessing, right, or upward social mobility, right, of getting kind of equitable access to things, right, the same chances, right, the same opportunities, right, to advance themselves and better their lives, and how some people don't, right, then you can see the people who are facing hunger, right, often have to make choices, right, and those choices might be between spending money on food and spending it on healthcare, right, and so then it becomes, you see how it's not just food justice that lives in the silo by itself, right, but how it's connected to these other things, right? And so food insecurity, right, can affect your access to healthcare. Food insecurity can affect your access to housing or transportation, right, to education, right, to investing in your community, right, adding money to that fund or that fundraiser to support kids in the neighborhood, right, who are raising money for sports or to get a better area for their park or something like that, right? You have these community programs, right, that rely on communities, right, to be able to invest money into them. And if those communities, right, are food insecure, right, they don't have extra money, right, to invest in their community. And so then you look at the community itself, right, and you see how that community is not as nice as another community, right? Is it because the people don't care about their community, right? Because that's the narrative that would be told sometimes. Oh, they live, in a crappy place and there's, everything's all run down and they just don't care about their properties, right? Well, that's not necessarily true, right? These people aren't choosing to be poor. They're not choosing to not upkeep their properties. They're not choosing not to invest money into nice parks and community enrichment programs, right? They're making hard choices every single day, right? And that's part of that gatekeeping, right? Is when we don't provide a system, right, that provides for their basic needs to be met in terms of nutrition, right? Then it affects their healthcare, their housing, their transportation, their education. And so then they don't have the opportunity to participate in all these other things too, right? And it's not that they don't want healthcare. It's not that they don't want good housing. It's not that they don't want to, drive to a job interview, right? It's not that they don't want to attend college, right? It's that they have to make some hard choices, and they don't have those choices because not everybody is advantaged in the same way, and some people have to make those choices, right? Another one, right? Food sovereignty, right? And this is the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food, right? To food that not only is sustain them as a population, but it's something that they connect to, that they feel comfortable with, that they know, right? That's part of who they are, right? And food sovereignty is simply the idea that people have a right to that, right? That people should be able to eat the things that they identify with, just in the way that you should be able to identify with yourself, right? In all the myriad ways, right, that we form our identities, right? Our food is part of our identity, and we have a right, right, to recognize who we are through that identity, right? And beyond that, then, right, food sovereignty also means the right to define their own food and agricultural systems, right? So to grow what they want to grow, right, to distribute it in the way that they think it's the best way to distribute that. And you can think about that in terms of just like food vendors, right? Food trucks or people who are pushing carts and vending food, right? Who gets to decide, right? Who gets to be a food vendor and who's not a food vendor, right? Whether that's legal or illegal, right? How much they should be paid, right? How, all sorts of things, right? With regard to the people who are actually growing and distributing and consuming the food, right? Who gets to make the decisions for them? And food sovereignty says, I am sovereign, right? The people are sovereign, right? To be able to make those choices for themselves, right? So this is as defined by Via La Campesina, right? Which is the peasants movement, international movement by food workers, right? Food producers to define these things for themselves. Right? And so I think these bullet points are things I've already said, right? But essentially the people who produce and consume the food, right, should have some degree of control, right, over the policies that govern that, right? And that when you take it out of their hands and put it in someone else's hands, then, right, you have an issue, right? Because you are putting in place a system, right, where some people get to make decisions for themselves and other people don't get to make decisions for themselves, right? And what does your food look like? Right? It looks like the people who are making the decisions about what your food looks like, and that may not match who you are, right? It means supporting communities, right, of any size, right, whether it be a sovereign nation, or whether it be communities, right, individual communities, right, making those decisions about the distribution of food, right, and finally recognizing, right, and not appropriating traditional practices. And what I mean by that is, there will be a lot of people out there who will talk about things like permaculture, right, and planting a garden in your backyard and using all these new techniques that are really neat techniques, right? And not recognizing, right, that really that's an appropriation of techniques that existed for hundreds of thousands of years before them, and not giving appropriate and due credit, right, to these things that they're presenting as something that's novel or new, or look at me, right? But instead, let me pay homage, right? Again, going back to this concept of who is the steward of this land, right? And are you paying homage, right, to the steward of this land, or are you just appropriating it, colonizing it, making it yours, right? And so again, right, when we have a loss of this food sovereignty, right, it's a system of oppression, right? And if you think of it just very narrowly, right, about large-scale agriculture, right, and the environmental consequences, right, of runoff pesticides that are used, of water diversion, right? You don't even have to talk about pesticides. You can just talk about how we use water, right, and where that water comes from and where that water would have gone if it hadn't been diverted, right, to feed a large-scale farming practice, and who does that hurt, right, downstream, right? These policies, right, have traumatized Native communities, right? Native communities who have perhaps, been placed in an area where they don't have access to the land that they used to have to. They don't have access to the environment, to the growing methods, to the water even, right, to support those methods, and then are made dependent, right, on other lesser foods, right, because they're not given access, right, to the right to dictate their own growing and distribution methods. And so instead, the US government says, oh, well, here's a handout, right? And so you can see this, right, in a lot of Native cultures, is some of the foods now that are commonly eaten are foods that are based on, right, these kind of poor supplements or these poor replacements, right, to say, well, we're going to stick you here and we're going to make you dependent on this, right, by giving you these foods, and now your culture is erased. That is trauma, right? And it oppresses people to this day, right, who are native to this land. Right? And so you have further impact, right? Environmental consequences, diversion of water, other industrial waste. You may have seen the paper write a lot about DDT. DDT is a pesticide that was a very common use. And it turns out it's really bad, right? And have you been reading in the paper about how a lot of that was just dumped in the ocean, right, off the Catalina Islands, right? And they're only just now discovering how much of that was illegally just dumped in these shipping channels, right? And so it's still having an effect on this, right? And how is that marginalizing communities, right? Communities who are already impacted, right? And are now, right, further impacted, right? So coastal communities, for example, right? Or communities that rely, right, on fishing, right, are impacted, right, by the things that have been done by larger industrial decision makers, right, who have made decisions on their behalf, right, and taken away their opportunity then, right, to have the same opportunities for advancement, right? And it only widens the wealth gap, right? When we take away land and opportunity from folks, right, and we consolidate that into bigger and bigger and bigger operations for the sake of efficiency, right? Well, we widen the wealth gap and we take away those opportunities, but do we replace those opportunities? Very often not, right? So you're out of a job. I'm sorry, you couldn't afford to farm anymore. It's just not profitable for you anymore. So we're gonna, we're gonna buy your farm for the least amount of money possible because you don't have any other choice. And what are you gonna do now? Well, that's your problem. The last one that I'll just cover quickly is body insecurity, right? And this one, it goes a little outside, but food justice work can go wrong, right? Just like all social justice work can be well-intentioned but go the wrong direction, right? Food justice work can also go wrong when we use it as a justification for quote unquote fighting obesity, right? Or we feed into these stigmas, right? That somehow folks who are facing hunger are victims, right? In the same way that we tell that narrative about people who are victims all the time, right? That they are victims of their situation and they have no choice and they need our saving. No, they do not need our saving, right? So first of all, there is no right size or shape. There are other health measures, right, that are actual measures of health. So we don't need to use size as an assumption, right, for whether somebody is healthy or not, right? People come in all shapes and sizes, and we should be proud of that, and we should make people feel good. Anything that makes a person feel like they are at war with their own body can't possibly be a good thing, right? That's not the right way to go, right? And so recognizing that, right, and talking about people about having positive relationships with food, right, is what the work is really about, right? Positive relationships with food, how they get food, where that food comes from, right? And not, your community is a bad community because it doesn't have good food access. Your body is a bad body, right, because it doesn't match this ideal that we've held up, right? The foods that you eat are bad foods because they don't match this ideal, right? That is not the way that we want to go with this, right? Shaming people, right? Regardless of what you're talking about, right? Shaming people is not an effective strategy. It's not helpful. It's just not a decent thing to do, right? And finally, you've heard the starving kids in blank, right, country, have it worse off, and you should appreciate what you have because of that, right? They don't need saviors, right? And so when we tell that narrative, right, we automatically place them in this category that they are victims, right, that need us to come in and save them, and again, uphold them to our ideal, right? Look at us, right? The perfect people who have all the answers. Let us just make you like us, right? So that you can be perfect as well, right? That's not the narrative that they need, right? That's not the help that they need, right? To be measured up to some other ideal, right? That says what you are, where you live, what you have access to is not good enough if only you were more like us, right? And food justice work goes wrong, right, when we try to uphold people to a particular ideal. And so finally, right, I'll kind of end with this quote that reinforces that same thing, right? Anything that reinforces inequity, right? Anything that reinforces bigotry, anything that reinforces prejudice or shame, right? That's not a justice movement, right? That's not what we mean. And if that's what you're doing with your justice, right, then you're going the wrong way, right? And food justice work that does not include, right, dismantling stigmas, right, that are attached to people, whether it be for their body or their community or the food they have access to or anything else with regard to food or other social justice issue, right, is not a justice movement, right, because it's not in line with what justice is. Justice is not making people feel bad about themselves. It's about empowering them, right, to match their identities, right, and to be proud of that, and and for that to matter, to be important enough, right, that could be an ideal as well. Okay. So there are lots of actions you can take, right? A lot of this has been kind of trying to frame it for you, right? But as kind of a final takeaway message, I would encourage you to do a few things, right? First of all, to reject business as usual, right? Every decision you make, regardless of what lane you're in, what field you're in, right, has the opportunity to either include people and uplift those people and give those people opportunities, or to exclude them, right, and make them feel like they have to measure up to some other ideal, right, that you are deciding for them, right? So in whatever space you are, I would encourage you to reject, right, the usual decisions and instead consider, right, is this decision, right, including folks and lifting them up, right? You can advocate for things you care about, right? You'll notice that most of these I've written kind of generically because they don't have to apply to just food, right? But they can apply to just food, right? A business as usual decision, right? We're getting a new food vendor, right? In the process, right, of accepting proposals for new food vendors on campus, right? That is an opportunity, right, to not just choose a food vendor, right, based on the same old usual things, right, usually cost, right, but to really think about how that food vendor, right, will uplift, right, the students on our campus, right, the particular students on our campus, and how it will connect to services that we have, like the Lantern Pantry, right? We can be business as usual about that decision, or we can ask, right, how in making this business decision, right, can we ensure that the food on our campus, right, matches the identities of our students, right, and that they are uplifted and made to feel important and made to feel included on this campus. That's what I mean by rejecting business as usual, right? You can advocate for things you care about, right? You may not think that that your voice matters much, but writing letters, right, can make a big difference, especially if you get a few people together and you all write similar sounding letters, right? Writing letters is an easy way to get engaged, right? You identify your representative, you know who that person is. You say, hey, I live in your district. This is something that affects me, it affects my community, and I want you to take action on this. And they do listen to those, right? They won't necessarily read it and respond to it themselves, right? But they get letters, right? And they have an aide that's going to categorize these letters and say, 800 people wrote to you, in favor of this issue. And so now it's something that's on their radar, right? And you'll see them at a press conference holding up a handful of letters and saying, I've received a bunch of letters about this, right? Evidently, y'all care about this. And since I'm supposed to represent you, right, I'm going to at least make a show, right, of doing something about this, right? And maybe they are just making a show, but at least you're talking about it. And that's the first step, right? The next thing you can do is volunteer, right, for the campaign of the person who's going to do it better. And the next thing you can do is you can run for office so that you can be the one making the decision, right? And that's what I want, right, is for you to be the ones making the decisions, right? So if you don't feel like you're getting a fair shake in life, right, well, work your way up and be there so that you're the one that makes the decision and says, you know what, I'm the ideal. Measure up to me. Right? And then finally, something that you can do just very personally, very easily in your own home, right? Acknowledge, right, that we are stewards of our land, right? Stewards of land that doesn't necessarily belong to us, right? Maybe, right, it does belong to you, right? Maybe, right, your family, right, was born here and lived here, and these lands belong to you, right? If that's not the case, right, pay homage, right, to those people by not wasting the resources that we have, right? And you can do that very easily, right, by reducing food waste, right? Talking about how food waste can be reduced on your campus, right? And you can even grow some of your own, right? Because when you grow some of your own, right, you take power away from the people who are growing food and distributing food and saying, this is the food that you have, right? You're saying, no, this is the food that I have because I grew it. That's power. All right, I'm going to stop here for a couple of minutes. In fact, I'll even stop sharing for a moment. Oh, look, there's so many more people here than when we started. Right? If you have questions, right, anything that came up, I think we have a little bit of time for some Q&A, and then I'll turn it back over to Emmanuel. I mean, if you don't have questions, I can just keep on talking. I can go for another hour.
I have a question. Something that stood out was the bullet point where you spoke about health measures measure health. So if you could explain, how accurate or inaccurate BMI is.
Yeah, that's a good question. BMI, right, body mass index, originally designed, right, as a very top level, looking at large sets of data, right, way of kind of categorizing data, right, and so it looks very much at a population as a whole, and attempts, right, to kind of divide that population into categories, and then to correlate those categories with whether or not they're more or less likely to have a health condition, right. And so when you're looking at large, such state data, right, you can say that on average, right, people who fall into kind of this lower category versus people who fall into this higher category may or may not, right, be more likely to have heart disease, for example, right? And it can be a useful metric, right, in terms of looking at large sets of data, right? It is a lot less useful when you look at it on an individual basis, right? Because you may or may not match the average, right? And you may or may not have the whole myriad of other risk factors, right, that are associated with that health condition, right? And so it's not, you can't make that one-to-one comparison to say, if you are BMI 27, I'm BMI 27, right? That puts me very solidly in the overweight category, right? But I think anybody that's met me understands that I do not consider myself to be overweight. And furthermore, right, okay, I'm in this overweight category, right? So, oh gosh, but you know what? I have blood pressure measurements, right? I have blood chemistries, right? I have all sorts of other measures, right, that are actual measures of health, right? And when I look at those, right, those are what matter, right? And so if my cholesterol is good and my heart rate is good and my blood pressure is good and I can participate in X amount of activity without being winded, I can do my daily activities. Okay, well, I'm healthy. So who cares if I'm BMI 27, right? And so weight and BMI and kind of numbers like that are correlated, right, can be useful for looking at large populations of data. But when you start trying to make decisions or say things about yourself based on these numbers that don't really work at the individual level that well, and suddenly you're getting down on yourself and saying, oh, I weigh too much, my BMI is too high, my weight's too high, right? And ignoring the fact that you're actually healthy, that's not a good thing, right? So they can be helpful, right? It's a nice ballpark, right, to kind of give yourself an idea. But even if you look at, what populations of data have been observed in order to come up with these numbers, right, you're going to find that they are white, mostly male populations, right? And so again, these cutoffs and these ideals that we're setting are based on a very specific population, right? And BMI may work for that population of people pretty well and may correlate pretty well with health outcomes, right? But does it work for everybody else? No, right? Because not every population is the same. And so, again, it becomes this kind of this behind the scenes system, right, that holds up one group of people as an ideal, and this is how we're going to measure everybody. And I'm sorry, but that's not cool.
Thank you. Thank you for explaining that. I have a question from Joyce Lee. What are some good resources to look into to support food justice in the LA area?
Yeah, good question. So a couple, right, that I really like. One of them is Food Forward. Right? So Food Forward is a volunteer program that goes into people's backyards, goes on to park properties and other properties where there are fruit-bearing trees, right? Whether they be mangoes or avocados or oranges or whatever, right? And they collect that food and then they distribute that food, right, through their various partners to people who could use that, right? So I have 3 citrus trees in my backyard that just drop all kinds of fruit on the ground, right? And it just rots, it just goes to waste, right? And so that's an organization, right, that's kind of on the ground, right, working in communities, developing partnerships to distribute food, right, and to make a difference in that way with stuff that would otherwise go to waste, right? If you're talking more in kind of like the policy area of things, right, the LA Good Food Council, right, is a really great, I think it's maybe lagoodfood.org, Emmanuel, if you want to look that up real quick. But the LA Good Food Council does a lot of calls to action, right? They keep up to date. They'll alert you to things. They have social media, right? So if you follow them on Instagram, for example, you can be alerted, right, to things that are happening now. So, for example, last year there was a Senate bill, right, in the California legislature regarding the decriminalization, right, of food vendors, right. And that passed, right? And at the time, they had a big campaign, right, for people to contact the legislature and say, "Hey, I'm really in favor of decriminalizing this," right, and turning that control over to local communities, right? And so this is kind of in the same vein as that food sovereignty, right? And saying, the state shouldn't be making decisions for communities about whether or not food vendors are good for those communities, and whether they should be allowed to participate in the economy of their communities, right? And so the state essentially turned it back over to communities, right? Now that spawned a whole host of other problems, right? Because now you have LA and the LA the public health department, right, and kind of the regulations, right, that are now regulating and letting people know, food vendors, know about this change, know about what regulations are now in place, how LA is going to regulate this, how they get a permit, right, and then you have as well the enforcement of those policies and how they're enforced and who gets to enforce those things, and whether we're taking the approach of kind of informing and helping people get those permits, right? Because the permits, they're not in and of themselves a bad thing, right? Having a food safety permit is a good thing, right? Because it means that that you're following certain procedures and you're going to serve safe food, and that people are not going to get sick from that, right? So in and of themselves, they're not bad things to have, right? But when we use them, right, as a tool, right, to take people off the streets or to give them fines or to further impact their ability, right, to contribute to their families and communities, right, rather than using them as a tool to help them provide safe food to people, right? Well, now we have the system of oppression, right, where we say, and I know I've gone off topic here, the resources LA Good Food Council, right, the issues they take up, right, are the issues, right, of food justice and systems of oppression. So those are 2 great resources, two organizations that I really like a lot.
Got a thank you from Joyce. Okay. Any more questions, y'all? Definitely like, the passion. I can see it. All right.
If by passion you mean talking a lot, then I must be passionate about a lot of things.
Passion and knowledge. All right, y'all. I'm going to share in the chat box.
Hey, hold on, let me stop you. Ceci's got one more question about the garden.
Oh, yes.
Which, great. Thank you for bringing it up. Yeah, we do have a community garden. It's a little overgrown at the moment because we haven't been on campus to tend to it. But the club that I'm a co-advisor for, right, the first formerly incarcerated radical scholars team, right, are the stewards, right, of that particular portion of land. And it's right by the L building. And then, yes, it is accessible to everyone, right? So as soon as we get back in there, we're going to clean it back up. We have a hydroponic system there, so it can be a teaching tool, right, about sustainability and using solar panels to power the pump, right? That pumps kind of the fish poop water up into the plants so that the plants can clean that water and return it back to the fish, and at the same time pull the nutrients out of that, right? So it can be a teaching tool. It's an opportunity to support the Lantern Pantry, right? To highlight that we have a Lantern Pantry, right? It's also just an area for sitting, right? And my goal is to plant more native plants there, right? So that people can be connected to the land and what grows here naturally and how those have been used, right? By the cultures who originally inhabited this land and were stewards of this land, right? So it can be a space, right, to pay respect to that, right? What good is a land acknowledgement? if you don't actually set aside some land, right, and say, this isn't our land, right? This is someone else's land. This can be a space where people can come together and can learn about and can understand, right, who this land really belongs to and what the cultures are, right, that are connected to this land. And we have a space that we'd like to expand into soon. So all of that is the very long answer to a simple question. Yes, it is accessible to all. It is free to be worked by all, right? The community garden does not belong to any one group of people, right? First are the stewards assigned with the upkeep, right? But the garden, we keep it up for everyone.
Thank you for that. If we can please, fill out our attendance check-in form. I pasted it on the Google chat. So we did have a Kahoot game, but I want to respect all your time. I think if I'm able to, still have that slide available, Dr. Hatch? So kind of just, I would like to end off with this, based on the action that Dr. Hatch has informed us about, regrowing your own food. Don't throw away those food scraps. They can definitely, replenish themselves. And you just got to take a little bit of attention, provide them with some attention. So here is just some images of some food scraps. It's a romaine lettuce. And, when you're getting ready to make some sandwiches, that bottom end, don't toss it. As you can see, at the bottom end, the root, if you submerge it within water for a few days and set it out by some daylight, you'll see in the middle picture, leaves will start to grow on their own. And then eventually, as the leaf gets bigger, if you have space, you can plant it outside, put it in the ground, and just watch it flourish. Aside from that, it's very therapeutic. I personally find it helpful, not only to my mental health, but to my pocket. I'm able to save some money. And if I can, let me see, I'm going to see if I can share my screen. I have this I'm going to share this post that I've done, and just a little example of those images growing. So here's the romaine lettuce, and you submerge it in water for a few days, and once you get this leaf to start growing, it'll be safe enough to be in the ground, at least in the outdoors. But it doesn't have to be placed in the ground. Just note that. You can keep it in a mason jar, you keep it in that container, but it'll start to grow. Some people don't have space, a garden space, and you can do that, simply in your kitchen, even in your bedroom. And just wanted to share this. I'd encourage you all to give it a shot, or at least think about it. Let's see, we have something in the chat. Yeah, definitely not a myth. And this is, in my garden, but it'll grow until you cut it. There's no stopping it, really. And I think this last image or video does a good job of showing that. So that's enough for, a few sandwiches. Aside from that, there are other plants such as green onions, cutting the bottom end, submerging them in a mason jar as well. There is a long list. If you just do a simple Google search Uh, Many people are doing this, and I'd encourage you all to give it a try. Um, I think with that, any final words, Dr. Hatch? Any other questions anyone may have came up with?
I would say, don't just encourage you to give it a try, right? But do it, right? Do it and post it to your Instagram, right? And tag what, ASPCC, and maybe
Yes.
ASPCC underscore sustainability. What are our social medias that people could tag and let us know that you've gone out there and you've done it, and you've taken your first step, right, towards making this a more just society, right, through your approach to thinking about food. Do it. I'm going to do it.
Yeah, it's my ASPCC, and I am also uh, sharing the link to the ASPCC Instagram. And thank you, Sean. He's also shared the username for the Sustainability Committee Instagram. So
I think it'd be really cool.
I want to thank you all for joining us, taking the time to get a little bit more informed, and also sharing space with us. Definitely, if you can please fill out that form, we would like to follow up and share any other future events we have planned. So for now, thank you very much, and you have a great day.
Thanks, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hatch.
Thank you.
Thank you, sis. So, Robert, thank you for showing up. I think you're at work.
Always good to see you, Robert.
Cool. Thanks, Sean, Sophia, Alexandra, for making it.
Great
You're
job.
welcome, Robert.
Great job. I was listening to both. I'm sorry, I was in a staff meeting that ran over.
No problem.
Are you
Yeah,
still
yeah.
streaming and recording? You could probably stop that.
Oh, that's right. Thank you. Yeah, I was trying to think.
That's okay. The YouTube usually runs about a minute behind. So
Oh, okay.
you stop it too soon and you we've lost the conversation at the end.
Oh, gotcha.
Wow.
So,
Well, great
Yeah.
job. Great job. How
Oh,
do you
cool.
feel?
how do
I feel
How do you
good.
feel?
I think Dr. Hatch, the question may have been for you as well.
That's for all of you.
Okay.
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about it. I mean, you know that I'm just getting started, right, with